Part 1. American Society. How did the 1960s shape the USA of today? The 1960s. The key word is change. 1. Introduction. As we begin to examine the decade of the 1960s, we will take a look back at more than half a century of history. If we needed to sum up that 10-year period in one key word, it would have to be change. Whether it was in popular music, art, fashion, design, film, TV, politics, science, literature, or sports, change was the dominant theme running through all of them. Many people have called the 1960s a revolutionary period, especially in terms of social patterns, including everything from mass media down to the most simple interaction between parents and their children at the kitchen table. On the surface, it's clear that in the 60s, many styles changed. Of course, styles change in any period of history, but there seems to be something especially significant about the 1960s. The changes in styles, the outward, visible aspects of such things as music, art, and even personal appearance in young people, reflected something deeper, a change in values. Traditional values. 2. Traditional values at the start of the 1960s. The word values indicates what is important to people. In other words, what things they value and how much they value them. There's no question that the many conflicts and crises of the 1960s motivated millions of people, especially young people, to start questioning what is known as traditional values. Traditional values are those values that have been consistently passed down from generation to generation through family, school, community, larger society, and the many established institutions that we recognize and even rely on for stability in our lives. 3. The traditional family unit. In America, for example, prior to the 1960s, it seems clear that the majority of people accepted and lived by traditional values and beliefs that were similar to those of their parents and grandparents. Examples of these traditional values might include a strong belief and emphasis on the role of family. In particular, the traditional ideal family unit, which consisted of a married mother and father who had 2 children, most likely a boy and a girl. This image of a traditional nuclear family was seen as the standard or even proper structure, and anything different, such as divorced parents or a single mother, was labeled a broken home, clearly indicating that it was not only different, but it was also deficient, not good enough. A quick look at the chart at left shows that in 1960, 65% of younger children live with married parents with only the father employed, working outside the home. 4. Gender roles. Men work to make money and women stay home. Another traditional value that eventually was challenged in the 1960s was the concept of the roles of men and women at home, in the workplace, and in society at large. The roles of men were clear. Once a man became an adult and got married, it was his responsibility to enter the workforce and start making money to support his family. Such phrases as the breadwinner and a good provider were standard ways to describe how men were expected to be, and a man who failed to fulfill this role was usually considered to be a failure in the eyes of society. Of course, men were also expected to play a role in the family as the father, but in many cases, expectations were not rigid and fixed. In other words, a married man's first priority was making money by working hard in order to support his family, and if he sacrificed the time spent with his family, it was simply unavoidable and understandable. The man's role was to be the breadwinner. For women, their role was clear. They should stay home, raise the children, do all of the housework and home-related work, and only when absolutely necessary for financial reasons could they work outside the home without fear of being criticized as a bad mother who neglected her children and husband. Naturally, there were exceptions to this rule, but for the great majority of American women prior to the 1960s, being a housewife or a homemaker was the limit of what they should expect out of their lives. 5. American patriotism, love of country. Another example of a traditional value was the strong belief in love of country, otherwise known as patriotism. One traditional view in America from the beginning in the 18th century to the 1950s can be summarized in the phrase, "My country, right or wrong." This phrase means I support my country no matter what, and I won't disagree with the decisions that our leaders, such as the president, make. Of course, there have always been American citizens who didn't agree with every action taken by the U.S. government, such as engaging in wars and conflicts in faraway lands, or imposing unfair and unjust laws on non-white citizens. But overall, the vast majority of the American public in the 1960s seemed to agree that love of country was a positive value, even a virtue. Again, this belief was generally considered to be the standard, normal way for a good American citizen to think and feel. 6. Institutions of authority, the powers that be. Local, state, and national institutions such as governments, public schools, universities, police officers, and the military were so established in American life that they and their practices were in many ways considered beyond question for most Americans prior to the 1960s. Even when private citizens disagreed with individual policies, they still accepted as fact that the moral foundations of these institutions were deeply planted and secure. In most cases, people who questioned or challenged the authorities were considered to be troublemakers who weren't willing to go along to get along like everyone else. A simple example would be the case of a schoolboy who had broken some rule or done something bad at school and received corporal punishment from his teacher. At the start of the 1960s, most American parents would not only approve of the physical punishment, they would add to it when the boy got home, even if they were not sure if the teacher had been completely correct or fair in the situation at school. In that way, Americans were taught to respect and obey authority figures without question. On a much larger scale, the American military represented the best and the brightest of American power and resourcefulness, and good American people were expected not only to accept but to support any and all actions by the armed forces, even when outsiders, meaning foreign countries, were highly critical of American intervention abroad. 7. Further considerations in regard to traditional values. Other areas of American life that illustrate traditional values include the status and roles of minorities, non-whites, in society, the sort of lifestyle choices that were considered respectable, the styles of music and art that were mainstream and acceptable, and even the personal appearance of men and women. In other words, the way they looked, their clothing, their hairstyles, and perhaps even the way they conducted themselves in terms of how they spoke and behaved toward others, particularly toward their elders, people older than them. This is the end of part 1. Please go to part 2.